very common thing for people to say, look, why me? Or why me now? If I hold on to this job now and don't do the brave or courageous thing now, then I'll be in a stronger position further down the line to make a courageous decision. But you point out that if everyone acts out of that sort of fear, imagine how much scarier the world would be than it already is.
But it's not just that. It's like, let's look at our own lives as an example. Have you found yourself becoming more or less risk averse as you've gotten older, right? We tell ourselves, oh, when I've made a little money, when I've built a name for myself, when I have a fan base, whatever, when I'm more secure, then I'll risk it. But the irony is you won't, because now those things will be precisely why you're not willing to do it. And I do understand there is a tension to it. It's not as simple as like, you must do it now, because again, also, if everyone did it right now, there never would be a position, no one ever would be in a position down the road. And I tell that story about some of my time at American Apparel, where I was asked to do something unethical and I didn't do it, but I also didn't quit on the spot. Now, I look back at that as a moment of moral cowardice. I fell short of my own standards. At the same time, I was then in a position to hold the leadership accountable in collaboration with other people 3 or 4 years later, that perhaps I wouldn't have been in had I quit on the spot. Now, the tension is, had I quit on the spot, might I have brought this outcome about earlier, perhaps? Or perhaps I would have just been falling on my sword for no reason. So, it's a real tension that every person is in. Do I act now? Do I act later? Do I wait till I'm in a better position? Do I go now? And I don't think courage is as simple as, if you see something, say something. Because what if by saying something, you're actually just, revealing your position, and now you're weaker and unable to do something about it. Same time, if you're always keeping your powder dry, if you're always waiting for someone else to do it, it's never going to happen.
And you're very concerned, aren't you, that if all of us take this attitude that it's up to the other guy or the other woman or whatever, then we just live in this paralysis. What do you think is it about those individuals who really do stand up? Because you make the point that we all have courage within us. We can all choose to be courageous. Why is it that in societies right around the world, some people step up, some people stand out, and others don't?
Yeah, I don't know exactly, but I think you get to a place where what you have to tolerate is actually worse than what you're risking, right? That's often what it is. It's like, would I rather lose my job or not be able to look myself in the mirror, right? For me, I think about this, if I say something that, upsets part of the audience, people go, you must have known this was going to cost you fans. And I go, yeah, but what's the point of having the fans if they then own you, right? Like, do I have the audience or does the audience have me? And so I think you have to think about what kind of life you want to lead. If you're the person who's like, I found this when I've visited people in politics. The reason they're not doing something, as we talked about, is because they're waiting to win the next office, then the next one. But it's like, you're a senator. You're one of the you're one of 100 most powerful people in the United States. And if you don't believe you have any agency, if you don't believe there's anything you can do here, I mean, what makes you so sure that slightly more seniority is suddenly going to unlock that, right? And so we kind of are in this situation where everyone wants everyone else to go over the top of the trench, but they're waiting until it's, they're in better position. And that's just not, as you said, it paralyzes us.
Important, though, as you also point out, not to judge others, because we just don't know what's filtering through that decision-making process that people have to go through when they make a decision like this.
I prefer, when I look at other people's cowardice or courage, or when I look at business or history or contemporary politics playing out, I try to look at it like a Greek tragedy or a Shakespeare play. Yes, I have strong opinions about what they should have done or shouldn't have done, or how it worked, or what. but the primary purpose is to learn a lesson in my own life. So this isn't to Monday morning quarterback, as we have the expression here. This isn't to go to criticize. This isn't to make you better than them, but this is to go, okay, I am disappointed that this politician is bought off by these interests, or I'm disappointed that this athlete is refusing to speak up about this issue because it will cost them these endorsements, right? Those are both legitimate criticisms, but you are not a head of state, nor are you an athlete. So it doesn't do you that much good to have that opinion unless it is getting you to a place where you go, well, what interests have captured me, right? What am I afraid to risk? And then what changes are you going to make in your own life based on this information?
You've written, well, a book about ego, essentially. Where does ego fit into courage?
It's a good question. I mean, we often mistake ego as confidence, and it's not. So I'd find that egotistical people are often, enormous cowards. Are there people who act courageously out of ego? Like they don't actually care about what's happening, but they just want to impress other people? I'm sure that's true. Probably not that big of a deal in the big scheme of things. But I think, ego is it's a toxic force. It's it whispers sort of sweet nothings in our ear that distract us from what's really important. But yeah, I guess they're related. I haven't thought too much about the relationality, though.
It's intriguing to read about de Gaulle through your eyes, and he is clearly a flawed personality.
Huge ego.
You mentioned him earlier. Let's talk a little bit more about him, the flight out of France, and then his return, and the extraordinary bravery as reported by a wartime reporter when he was giving essentially his victory speech at the liberation of Paris. This was an amazing character who once said, I think, that he was too poor or born too poor to bow.
Yes. I mean, when you think about what de Gaulle is, in a way, so Bill Belichick, who's the head coach of the Patriots, the New England Patriots, has said something like, the individual can't have ego, but the team must have ego, right? Or that basically the individual must subsume the ego into the team identity. And perhaps if we're looking to excuse or explain de Gaulle, it was his ability to sort of singularly take on the identity of France. So when we see de Gaulle being the intractable, difficult prima donna, it's not him, the man. It's him, the representative of the country, the man in the impossible situation of essentially willing a failed state back into existence, right? France collapses, right? France gives up. France betrays itself. And de Gaulle is one of a handful of people who basically says, no, I don't consent to that. And so there is this monumental, almost inhuman feat that he is tasked with. And I don't know if anyone else could have done it. That he manages to rescue that nation, not militarily. England does that. The United States does that. The Soviet Union does that. Yeah.
And Russia. Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's what I was just saying. Yeah, the Soviet Union does that. But he symbolically rescues France, right? He sort of refuses to let it be a lesser power, a lesser party. He insists on equality. He insists on respect, and brings it back from disaster. And so, yeah, if there is an illustration of the paradox of ego and courage, de Gaulle embodies it, to be sure.
We know that heroes and heroines aren't all already famous, huge international figures. One example you talk about is the murder and rape of a woman on her doorstep in America. And I think partly gained so much publicity because there was apathy among so many of her neighbors.
Yeah, the Kitty Genovese case. Yeah. People, it's a shorthand in the United States as like what happens when good people do nothing.
So this is a case that I'd never heard of, and it's obviously a brutal tragedy. But essentially, the point was that so many people seem to have rolled over in bed sort of got more involved in what they were watching on television, except this other young woman. And I'll leave it to you to describe what happened.
So it's become the shorthand in the United States for what happens when neighbors don't care about each other, right? An apartment complex is the scene of a brutal sexual crime, and nobody does anything. And as she's murdered and lay dying in the street, except one neighbor actually did do something. One neighbor did rush down and called the paramedics and cradled the dying woman in her arms. And was there for her as she died. And it's beautiful and tragic. She doesn't manage to save her life, but she was not indifferent. But then demands no credit for this, actually, is indicted, in the court of public opinion with everyone else as having done nothing, but it wasn't true. And so, we often think of courage on this sort of grand scale. We go, oh, if the Nazis ever overran my country, I would be like de Gaulle. It's like, it's probably not going to happen, and it's probably not true. And so we often ignore, as they say, the opportunities to be courageous, for our nearest neighbor, for actual human beings, for people we know. And so I wanted to tell that story as, heroism isn't stopping the crime always. It's not riding into battle. It's also just being a decent human being when everyone else is too afraid to get involved.
You mentioned the Nazis. Let's briefly talk about Rommel, the famous German general, and the fact that he was both incredibly brave, but also the absence of bravery on his part and other German generals in the build-up to war, when some of them thought that Hitler was a disaster, but they didn't speak up. They wanted someone else to speak up, and the consequences of that.
Yeah, so to go to this point about sort of bet the company bets, Rommel and a bunch of the other German generals, they all just sort of think this is not their problem. They're like, our job is to lead the army wherever the state says. And is there something to be said about the civilian military control? Of course. But there are also special circumstances. And if Hitler doesn't justify the special circumstances, no one does, right? But I think what's interesting about Rommel is that he ignores and he ignores and he ignores until, preposterously late. He's like, I think there's something wrong with this Hitler guy. And he participates in an assassination attempt, which does not succeed. But it happens to coalesce very nicely with one of Rommel's theories, which is that, he talks about fortune favoring the bold. He says it's better to be bold than timid. And he says, but then if you're never bold, then eventually you'll have to gamble. And gambles are worse than sort of bold moves. Having to assassinate Hitler in 1944, whenever it was, that's a desperate gamble that was only necessary because so many people did nothing all along the way. I was at a dinner with some Republican politicians a few months ago, and they were talking about, Facebook's decision to ban the president of the United States from social media, which is an alarming, uncomfortable thing, right? I don't know if anyone wants private social media platforms to be banning heads of state.
Both a blessing and deeply uncomfortable.
Yes, exactly. And I listened to these politicians talk about their concerns. Do we want this? Blah, blah, blah. And I was like, whoa. Do you know why Facebook had to do this? It was because you didn't do your job for 5 years, right? Like, you served in the administration. You're a Republican Party official. You're a Republican voter. You go on media every single day to talk about current events. You talk directly to the Fox News audience, and none of you did anything. You all expected that this would resolve itself. You expected somebody else to go over the top. And then finally, Facebook has to do it when it ends in an insurrection and the attempted assassination of the vice president of the United States, the first failed peaceful, not technically the first, but really the first overt coup attempt in American history. And finally, Facebook looking around as the last as the last man standing had to do something about it. So again, we often are quick to indict or speculate about what other people have done, and we completely neglect all the opportunities that we had along the way to interject ourselves into the fold or just do our basic duties.
You talk about a decision you made in 2016 related to Trump and writing a piece in your column that was anti-Trump, and this represented, I think, as you saw it, a bit of a threat to your own career and as an opinion writer, and it wasn't published.
Yeah, it was my first. It was actually at a paper owned by Jared Kushner, and I'd sort of naively thought, well, these things are separate, and then all of a sudden you cross a line, and they're like, no. And I remember thinking, what am I going to do? And it was inconceivable to me that I would not say what I felt I needed to say. And I know it cost me fans because I got an email about it this morning from someone, right? Like it's still, a thing that I hear about. But I think you get to a point where, silence feels worse than whatever the consequences for speaking up. Now, again, this wasn't Alexander Vindman, who I had on my podcast a few months back, who sort of speaks up, is the whistleblower who causes Trump's impeachment. He loses his army career. His brother loses his job. He gets death threats. There's nothing quite like that for me, so I don't want to overstate it. But the point is, we come to different junctures in our lives where we can do the easy thing or the hard thing. We can do the popular thing or the unpopular thing, and you got to choose what that's going to be. And cumulatively, those choices add up to who you are.
It's very interesting, actually. I mean, we live in the age of social media, of course, and it's very easy once you talk about fans, talk about followers, very easy to play to the gallery, to play to the echo chamber, and you find yourself not wanting to say certain things because you think you'll lose followers.
Bad for business.
A lot of this is about fear. I mean, it is about fear, isn't it? And you say in the book that they're more or many more before they're counted. Just explain that to our viewers.
There's a great story about Ulysses S Grant, one of America's greatest generals, and I think actually one of our more underrated presidents. Actually prevents a war between the U.S. and the U.K., little known fact, over the capture of a Confederate submarine. But Grant tells this story early on in his military career. He's crossing the plains of Texas, actually not far from where I am now. And he's alone with another officer, and they hear these wolves. And it sounds like hundreds of wolves, like the worst, scariest sound he's ever heard in his life. And the other officer says, Grant, how many wolves do you think there are? And this guy was more experienced than Grant. And so Grant didn't want to sound scared. So he goes, probably like 20, the lowest number he thought it could possibly be. And they finally come upon the wolves, and there's two of them. There's two wolves who would, and we can understand why from an evolutionary perspective, it's good for them to sound like they're more numerous than they are. And so they come up across these two wolves, and Grant says that for the rest of his life, he never forgets this lesson, that there's always more of them before they are counted. So, you think you don't want to say something, you don't want to piss off your audience, you don't want to align yourself with this group or that group because there's going to be critics. And there will be, there will be. But they are not as big and as intimidating or usually as numerous as you think that they are.
Reminds me of the middle of the night in a storm in just outside the Masai Mara in Kenya, when I thought I heard what sounded like 10, 20 lions, and the very, very brave Masai guards came to our rescue. But in fact, there wasn't even a single lion. There were 100 wildebeest, and I'd mistaken the roar of the lion for a wildebeest, or the other way around. So tell us a little bit more about how we as individuals can set out deliberately to be more courageous.
Yeah, I think it's important you don't think of courage as this like identity that you get, like I'm an entrepreneur or whatever, I'm courageous. I think first off, you leave the labels to other people, but I think it's easier to focus on just consistently making more courageous decisions in the course of your daily life, right? Turn the water to cold in the shower, hit publish on the thing you were hesitant to do. Don't sit on the doubt or the criticism or the feedback in the staff meeting. Don't be afraid to both ask for help or put yourself out there. But you cultivate courage as a part of your life, as opposed to this thing you think you'll do when the Nazis overrun your country, right? Think about it as something you do day to day, as opposed to a once in a lifetime, sort of moment with destiny.
So we can make a habit of it, in other words.
Yeah.
Talk to us about the four virtues as described or seen by the ancients, and to what extent they're relevant today, and how courage fits into that.
Well, I think they're both timeless and timely. So the four virtues, I'm actually working on a series. So Courage is the first book in a 4-book series on the cardinal virtues. The cardinal virtues being courage, self-discipline, justice, and wisdom. And I think all the virtues are related to each other. What good is courage if not in pursuit of justice, right? Rommel, incredibly courageous on the battlefield, but when you're fighting for the worst cause that ever existed, it tends to undermine the courage, right? But how do you know what the right cause is? How do you know what the right thing to do is? Well, this leads you to the discipline or the virtue of wisdom. Self-discipline is how much courage, right? When does courage become recklessness, right? What's the right amount or the insufficient amount? So these four virtues are interrelated, and I would argue impossible ultimately to separate. And that's why I'm doing it as a series.
I'd just pick you up on this idea of what is courage without justice, because I mean, there are other examples where courage can perhaps be a virtue without justice necessarily being part of the picture. So, for example, let's look at the guy who flew across the Atlantic in the 1920s. I mean, that wasn't really about justice, but there's something deeply impressive about it.
Yeah, that's true, but I think you would argue that he is exploring the unknown for the good of humanity. Let's say Charles Lindbergh, right? Charles Lindbergh, who I talk about in the book, first to fly across the Atlantic solo. Is he doing it for the prize money? A little bit. But is he also trying to push the boundaries of human performance and trying to prove aviation as a viable concern? So justice isn't always like what's legal, what's illegal. It's not always, for the, about righting a terrible wrong. But I think that the idea is that the cause is everything. What are you doing it for? Jumping out of an airplane because it's your birthday and you want to do something fun is not quite the same as, parachuting behind enemy lines to be part of the French resistance.